Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to It's an Inside Job. I have a special guest with us today, Dr. Brian Little. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, our mutual friend Jim put us into contact, and I find your background and the books you've written to be very, very intriguing, especially when it comes to personality, because I think a lot of us get focused on personality, and sometimes we think it's a fixed trait, sometimes it's a floating trait. And that's what I'd like to do is dive into your expertise and your knowledge and to understand more about the dynamics of who we are.
That sounds good.
Maybe we have some time together, just a little over an hour, and you've written two
Mm.
books. Your first one was Me, Myself, and Us: The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being. So I was wondering, maybe could you give us a sort of a conceptual understanding of what the book is about? The first one?
Yeah, the first book was really an overview of human personality in the broadest sense, and sort of covering a lot of the history of personality psychology over the last few decades. And I start off with the most prevalent conceptual framework for looking at traits, which are called the Big Five or the Big Six or the Big Few is a nice term that I
Mm,
think captures the delimited number of basic traits of personality. I go on to give some other types of dimensions of personality,
mm,
and then, just as I did in a TED talk, I stop halfway and say, "Is this it? Is this all we are? Just a bunch of traits?" And the second half of the book is in large part an answer to that question. There are fates beyond traits. And so the overall focus of that first book is is examining the case for how traits are important in understanding how we are and how we interrelate with other people. And then pivoting at the end towards how there are other aspects of personality,
mm.
particularly the personal projects we engage in our life, that will tip us into thinking of ourselves as far more active and less passive, far more self-creating.
Mm.
The second book is based on my TED Talk and is much more zooming in on that latter part of the first book to look at what I call free traits and restorative niches and how personal projects and the sustainable pursuit of them is what really comprises human flourishing. So the two are basically covering similar territory, but the second book is more focused on my own research over the last 40 years.
Well, maybe we can begin with the first book because it seems it's a much more general take, and then you do a much more refined approach in your second book. In your
Yep.
first book, you talk about three factors: biogenic, sociogenic, and ideogenic.
Yep.
I was wondering for our listeners, can you sort of define what those three concepts are and how they shape our personalities?
Yes. Um, Biogenic influences on personality are those that are in part genetic. It's
Mm,
biogenic, meaning developed out of biological processes, not biogenetic. Genetics is just one part of it. Neurophysiological, biochemical features, um, those that we bring with us to situations that are the result of our biological propensities. And for example, people who are highly extroverted have a biogenic tendency
mm,
to be under optimal levels of arousal, so they need to seek out stimulation to perform effectively, whereas those who are more introverted or over the optimal level, they need to
mm,
get a quiet environment to achieve their most efficient and efficacious pursuits. So the biogenic feature underlying that is differences in the arousability in the neocortex,
mm,
for example. Sociogenic refers to the cultural norms and roles that we acquire as we develop. And these are in the case of extroverted and introverted conduct, for example,
Mm,
there are norms governing whether you act in what we would regard as highly extroverted ways or whether you're more introverted, not by nature this time, but by nurture within the cultural context
mm,
of your country or your region or subregion. So there are many cultural features that operate right down to the level of your neighborhood
mm,
and interpersonal norms governing your everyday life, so that you may be enjoined to act very extrovertedly because that's the kind of culture you are in. So if you have a biogenic tendency toward extroversion and a sociogenic um, affordance for it in your environment, then that's going to increase the likelihood that you'll be extroverted in frequent aspects of your daily life.
mhm,
Ideogenic comes from the same root as idiosyncrasy, and it refers to those drivers of our everyday pursuits
mm,
that are personally idiosyncratically constructed. And this is where I think the richness of human personality comes in. These are the self-reflections, the personal projects, the strivings that one engages in
mm,
that in part, not solely, but in part can provide a resolution of the biogenic and the sociogenic claims on your life. And so somebody who's very extroverted, but and lives in a highly introverted culture may find that ideogenically they
mhm,
need to shape their behavior in ways that sort of go against their first nature to accommodate um, to the um, to the sociogenic. And so all three of these play a really important role in how we present ourselves in daily life. And I think it gives rise to many of the conflicts and some of the delightful eccentricities we have as a species, because we often will say of a person, "Good God, what's with Jim today? He's acting so reserved in this
mm,
meeting." And then you realize that for him, his personal project for this meeting is to show that he can be reserved.
mm,
And so we have this capacity to gate or to shape or to craft our personalities way beyond nature and nurture, which most of us in personality science um, no longer see as a dichotomy.
mm,
They're blended, and genes, for example, under the biogenic side of things, um, can reach expression
mm.
only through the stimulation of environmental contingencies and so on. So we've moved way beyond nature nurture and into the intricacies of the choreographies of daily lives.
Yeah, because when you talk about ideogenic, that's more sort of, as you said, personal projects, and I'd like you to operationally define that in a second. But that comes down to our habits, our passions, things that we do in our lives that kind of light our internal fire. And I was just wondering because a lot of us, we talk about the social influences, the cultures that we live within, and how they shape us. And a lot
Yeah.
of us can find it a struggle sometimes to conforming to societal norms, but also trying to find our own authenticity, finding our own sense of agency. I mean, this ideogenic, biogenic, I understand. It's the nature, it's the genetics, and then
Yeah.
sociogenic is the societal or the nurture aspect. But
Yep.
ideogenic, I find that very fascinating. I'd like to explore that. But maybe you can expand on, how individuals, if they do or if they can't, conform to
Mm.
societal norms, but while trying to pursue their own agency or personal authenticity.
Yeah. Authenticity is a fascinating word. I think that there are three kinds of authenticities, and we tend to tell a person to be herself or tell him to act naturally or And
Mm.
I sort of see it as a kind of fidelity.
Okay.
Authenticity is a fidelity to each of your natures, your first nature, your second, and your tertiary nature, if you wish. The first nature is biogenic. And so this is showing authenticity in the sense of um, being true to how you feel,
Mm.
doing what feels good and natural, unedited by social constraint, unedited by what your own personal goal may be in that particular situation. And so it may be more automatic. It usually is automatic rather than cognitively constructed.
Mm.
And when you say, there's Dave, good old authentic Dave, he's being the Looney Tune at the party
Mm.
and, wearing the hat made of beaver skins. Um, and that's a kind of fidelity to the biogenic. But we can equally say that you can show fidelity to your life tasks. Being a mom, these are socially constructed. Uh, there's, of course, a blend of biogenic and social construction to parenthood. But I'm thinking of being a scientist, being
Mm.
a professor, being a doctor, being a good sister. These have constraints and roles and rules that one can show fidelity to. And many people will say, I don't know what you mean by be myself. What are you talking about?
Mm.
What do you mean authenticity? I'm a mom with a kid who's sick. That swamps everything about me.
Mm.
But whether I'm authentic or not seems almost to be a kind of cheapening of the nature of my experience. I'm consumed with my social, she may not say social role,
Mm.
but we would say in personality science, she's overwhelmed by the sociogenic claims on her life that are embodied in a child that needs her commanding attention. And then, and so that's showing fidelity to what one ought to do. Maybe, first of all, in biogenic with what one wants to do, and then with what one ought to do.
Mm.
And then the ideogenic is that much more personalized, idiosyncratic, singular aspect of George that makes him Georgian, or of Elizabeth that makes her Elizabethan.
Mm.
These are proclivities, projects, tasks that you make your own, that you invest in, that you commit to, and give shape and meaning to your life. And that is also showing a fidelity, is showing a fidelity to what matters to you. Um, it's important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean at all that it's selfish. It's simply that it's
Mm.
personally constructed. And that means that we may be able to anticipate the biogenic and the sociogenic aspects of a person's personality by knowing where they are, how old they are, what culture
Mhm.
they're in, and a bit about their biology. But in order to understand the ideogenic, you've got to engage in a narrative. You have to make inquiries of the person. You have to ask them. They are the authors of their life, and it is in that ideogenic domain that you begin a conversation. And I often say that, many of us in personality science have grown accustomed to using trait measures as the gold standard for assessing a person's personality.
Mm.
And for a while, I was part of a movement that went against this, saying situational and other factors is more important. But there's no denying that the biogenic and the trait aspect of personality is really, really important. And assessing that is important, but it's just the beginning of a conversation about you. So your listeners, if I said, we had a pretty good idea from where you're living, of the sociogenic impacts on your personality. We have a pretty good idea
Mm,
of what you would regard as wrong or right or worthy or estimable. Um, and we may know about your biogenic traits. But if I want to know what really steers your life, what is creating the motivational force for
mm,
you to get up in the morning and carry on, I need to say, uh, Marianne, um,
mm,
tell me what are you up to? What matters to you? What's salient in your life right now?
mm,
She may say, well, it's Doug, my husband. He's not well. And let me tell you a bit about that
mm,
project and helping him through his sickness. And Jason, once you get to that level of discussion with an
mm,
individual about the personality, everything seems to change. Instead of putting people in pigeonholes and
mm,
saying that we can understand your personality,
mm,
we're we're saying, let's talk. You know a lot about what drives you that we can help. We know a bit too. We can help you frame that. We can help you reflect on it in ways that can lead to improvements in your life.
mm,
And so one of the other main features of the both books is a focus on human flourishing. And the central proposition is that um, human flourishing depends upon the sustainable pursuit of core projects in our life. And the sustainability relates both to the biogenics. It's easier to sustain a core project in your life if you have the personality traits that make that easier to carry out. And we can get into some of those traits in a minute if you
mhm,
wish. And it's also helpful for the advancement of a core project in your life if you have what we call the affordance of the environment of the
mm,
social context. If you're driven to do X and your environment says don't even think about it, then it's not going to be sustainable
mm,
unless you change society. And so here's where we start getting into what I call the social ecology of human personality. I
mm,
think we've been far too focused on what the technical term is integumented nature of personality, that is
mm,
stuck inside the person's head. There is a social ecology out there of things that allow us, things that block us, things that provide paths, um, implicit barriers, explicit barriers, from the level of the person you're living with to the global crisis in the world right now.
mhm.
God help us. And I think we need, in the field of personality psychology, I think we take an extremely broad view of the human condition, from neurons to narratives,
Mm.
and that, for me, is part of the excitement of the field.
Because you speak to fidelity or clarity when it comes to authenticity, and then you talk about human flourishing and the sustainability of
Mhm.
a core project. Some people seem they just know what they want to do in life and their passion. It shows through their hobbies, through their focuses, through their profession, and they move
Yeah.
through. Then there's other people who seem to be spinning their wheels, who seem to be constantly in idle, who haven't found that direction. Considering the biogenic, the sociogenic, and ideogenic of that, those
Mhm.
people on, let's say, on the right who are able to kind of find their focus, and way on the left, who can't seem to gain any traction.
Mhm.
Has what what influences those personalities? Why are some people so they seem to be so well in tuned with what they want to do, and they just chase after it, and their job becomes their life, it becomes their hobby, becomes their passion, where other
Yeah.
people, they could be 50, 60, and they still haven't kind of found
Yeah.
their traction.
Yeah. It's a great question. The Here is where certain stable traits of personality
mm,
um, help tilt us in certain directions. For example, the thing that would be probably most predictive of the person who's frozen and is
mhm,
unwilling to take the risks to advance projects in their lives would likely to be characterized by facets of what we call neuroticism, anxiety, vulnerability,
mm,
a fear of um, doing things incorrectly, doing things that are wrong, and a sensitivity to punishment cues in the environment.
mm,
Um, the contrast here is with the extroverted personality, and the stable extrovert versus the rather more neurotically introverted person. They make very fine contrasts in that the more neurotic introverted person is likely to get stuck at the inception stage of a
mm,
project, whereas the more stable extroverted person is more likely to advance. Why are they more likely to advance? Is in part, only in part, because they are highly sensitive to and responsive to reward cues in the environment. So, in a way, they're half full,
mm,
glass half full people, and may literally not see the negative aspects of a situation
mm,
or an incipient project that they're more sensitive or hypersensitive comrades and friends and partners may see all too clearly.
mm,
They run the risk, the more extroverted, stable people, of going into situations or advancing passions and pursuits that are very risky.
mm.
And risk is good if it's calibrated, and it's foolhardy if it isn't. And so I believe there is a kind of superordinate aspect of personality, which is the capacity to be flexible, to know when to act extrovertedly, to know when to go for it, and when to pare back. In other words, instead of seeing these as fixed traits,
Mm,
we can see them as free traits in which we are able to shift our personality style and set and perceptual
mm.
processes to meet the challenges of the situation we're in, or to advance the project that's got us excited and worried simultaneously.
So that would suggest this would
Mm.
require a level of self-awareness to step back
Yeah.
from our own internal narrative, maybe redraw or rewrite that narrative if I need to be more extroverted in this case, or I need to be whatever, more introverted in this case. So a
Yes.
level of self-awareness and maybe also self-compassion are necessary skills in order to be able to do this.
Yeah, very much so. And I'm happy that you mentioned self-compassion. Um, it's it's really important. Life is complex, and we have multiple
Indeed.
claims upon us, and
Mm,
our first natures, our biogenic nature may impel us into situations where we're hurting.
mm,
We are um, excitable, agentic, extroverted people, and we suddenly find ourselves in a life situation where totally inadvertently we've hurt a lot of people around us
mm,
because we're pursuing with all the passion in the world our projects.
mm,
And life is a social ecology, and the you may find that the trade-off that you have perhaps inadvertently
mhm,
made between your own happiness and your flourishing is that you've alienated one of the major sources
mm.
of the sustenance and the sustainability of your project, which could be your partner.
mm,
your business partner, your romantic partner. Um, you don't realize after 7 years of pursuing this goal that is the pinnacle of achievement for you that nobody you really care about likes you anymore.
mm,
You've become a jerk. And
mm,
you may say, what? Me? How can you
mm,
possibly say I'm a jerk? How would you understand who is a jerk and who isn't a jerk? And then you say, oh my God, I'm being a jerk by asking that question.
mm,
And I think that these arise out of the conflicts between different ways of being as framed by these different sources, the ideogenic,
mm,
the biogenic, the sociogenic. And um, it makes life complex. It and it means that sometimes we're going to hurt
mm,
and we're going to hurt others. And here's where this is why I say it's great that you raise self-compassion. You can beat yourself up by
mm,
saying, what the heck have I done
mm,
after 7 years of pursuing this fantastic project? And I'm now at the pinnacle of my career and my kids aren't speaking to me.
mm,
And I've lost the only woman I've really loved. What 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 was I doing? I'm such a fool.
mm,
And I think you need to step back and say, this happens so often, and don't keep beating yourself up.
mm,
Change, make restitution
mm,
about new projects that are going to be more sustainable. Say, look, I could never have done what I did if it hadn't been for you guys. And I've never told you that. And
mm.
I'm telling you now. And if I keep talking, I'm going to start crying. So give me a beer and let me get out of this situation because it's very uncomfortable for me.
Yeah,
These are the kind of conversations.
yeah,
Yeah.
and hopefully they haven't burned too many bridges. We've
Yeah.
spoken to extrovert and introversion. I think this dynamic, how we sometimes sort of, your term was sort of pigeonhole. Now you talk
Mm.
about these traits in your book. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the nuances or the sort of the common misconceptions around these two
Yeah.
traits, introversion,
Yeah.
extroversion.
Yeah. Could I maybe introduce the very briefly the five traits, just so that the viewers get a sense of each of those, or is
The
this
big
too early?
five, you mean the personality traits? Yes, please, please, please,
Yeah, great. Okay, I think I think this way we can get into nuances which you request, which I think is terrific and which I like to deal with.
please.
The So much of personality trait assessment is the fixed notion that you're either an extrovert or an introvert, and or you're stable or neurotic, and
Yeah.
I find that misleading.
Mm,
And I think we've already seen the reasons why I feel that is so. That said, there's a very compelling set of literature now, decades long, that has shown that there are five major dimensions of personality. They spell out the acronym OCEAN. So O stands for openness to experience, C, conscientiousness,
mm,
E, extroversion, A, agreeableness, and N, neuroticism. And in the context of how these predict human flourishing and human accomplishment and health and happiness and success and so on, we might see these as things that the traits can predict. Um, they have a really interesting predictive capability, these traits.
mhm.
First, these traits are normally, I'm being a professor, I'm showing a normal curve with my finger and I can't help it. They're distributed in the shape of a normal curve. So it just won't wash to say you're an extrovert or an
Mm,
introvert. They're normally distributed, so the most people are actually going to be regarded as ambiverted, right in the middle. And then as it spreads out towards the extremes, you have people who are extremely extroverted, extremely introverted,
mm,
and so on. And it's the same with each of the other traits. So that's one thing. They're normally distributed rather than bimodal, which means that you're clumped at one end or the other end.
mm,
They're Most are in the middle. The second is that they are independent of each other. They're orthogonal, which means that if you're, let's say, open to experience, and the next one we look at is conscientiousness, you can be high or low in conscientiousness. Or if you're high in extroversion, you may be high or low in neuroticism. So each is independent of the other, and this means that when you look at them all together, statistically, they're able as a set of dimensions to predict outcomes very effectively. If we go very briefly through each of them in the context of what do they predict, um, the let's start with the O of ocean, openness to experience. Those who are high in openness to experience, in contrast to those who are more closed, really have a very low threshold for enthusiastic interest in things. What's that? That's really interesting. Hey, do you mind if we stop here? I'd like to see what that is. Isn't that amazing?
Mm.
This is a typical open to experience person. The closed person, I don't think so. I'm seems a little out of the conventional. I think we'll keep on driving. And um, the third major uh, assumption that we proffer in personality science is that it's not the case that there's a good end and a bad end
Mm.
of these dimensions. There's a tendency for us to see extroverted, agreeable, stable people as better people, and so conscientious, certainly. But extremes on these can be
Mm.
very dysfunctional. So if we take somebody who is open to experience, they may be so open to experience that they're empty-headed, that everything is exciting to them and interesting, and they have to explore everything. And so it makes it more difficult for them to focus.
Fear of missing out,
Those
right?
who are, right? And those who are uh, lower on openness to experience can be they do the tried and true. They want to do things that are by the box and by the rule book, and that can be very good. We need
Mm.
those people in society, but it can also lead to a very rigid way of living, and
Mm.
it doesn't redound to the benefit of their own progress in life or of society. So open to experience, if we just take the high end, very much associated with creativity, and highly creative people are really fascinating. There's a chapter in the first book just devoted to creativity and the characteristics. So one of the characteristics of highly creative open people is that um, they experience both positive and negative emotions relatively more than those who are low on that dimension of creativity.
In the
And
sense
that
of
means,
intensity,
what's that?
in the sense of intensity of those emotions.
Yes, in the
Yeah.
sense of intensity and also frequency. And the frequency and the intensity is partially determined on where in the creative project they are.
Mm.
And so with a highly creative person, you'll often find that when they're stuck they're terrible to work with. They can be real jerks
Mm.
because, don't bother me. Go away. I'm busy
Mm.
transforming Western thought, you know, or at least a
Yeah.
better game that I'm
Yeah.
trying to create. And so they're far more likely to experience these bouts of frustration
Mm.
and anger. On the other hand, when things are going well for them and they're exploring in their creative zone,
Mm.
they are just experiencing the peak of emotional positivity. They are flowing, they are happy, they are joyful, they are
Mm.
exultant. And so working with highly creative people can be a real challenge.
Mm.
And one of the chapters in the book calls The Myth of the Creative Hero. We often say these highly creative geniuses are worthy of a great deal of admiration. This is true. No one can deny that. But by the same token, they would never have completed those creative projects
Mm,
without those who are less open to experience, far higher on that next trait of conscientiousness that would allow them to without whom
mm,
they would probably never get those creative projects finished. So if we go to the conscientiousness, this is a fascinating one, Jason, because it throws up something that I think is unanticipated. Highly conscientious people, as you can imagine, are those who get things done. They get them
mm,
done on time. They're efficient. They're reliable. They're dependable. They're hardworking, they're high in achievement orientation, and consequently, they do better in school, they do better
mm,
in organizations, they get better grades, they get promoted, they earn more money. Everything seems really, really great for a highly conscientious person. Um, but the other thing is that they're also healthier.
mm,
And that early on in personality science, it was seen as interesting. I mean,
mm,
not terribly surprising, but interesting because the other domains seem logical. But why are they healthier? Well, I think it gets down to them being more likely to follow up on health regimens.
mm,
They stick to the doctor's recommendations. They will internalize a plan for aerobics or whatever it is that enables them to keep fit. And they actually live longer
mm,
than those who are at the opposite end of the spectrum. Um, but again, in terms of overdoing it, highly conscientious people can also become obsessive compulsive.
mm,
And so they have to get, and you've got aspects of perfectionism that can um, compromise the forward thrust of a person's concerns because they just can't live with not getting everything perfect. And it is the enemy of the good in many
And I
cases.
guess almost what springs from that is almost like imposter syndrome, the sense that, people are going to discover that I am not as conscientious, that that I should not be here, that someone's made a mistake. And so they will go, again, that leads into perfectionism. They will work
Yeah.
logically, they know they've done a good job, but emotionally, they're
Yeah.
doing it 3 or 4 times, repeating it, just crossing everything, the I's and the T's and such.
It's a
So,
very good point.
mm,
Yeah, it's a very good point. They can engage in this compensatory and over the top behavior. George Kelly has a really interesting definition of hostility, which is the attempt to extort validation for a view for
I
a
like that.
viewpoint for a viewpoint
Mm,
you know um, is probably wrong.
mm,
And so this is an attempt to extort validation for people seeing you as right when you know that maybe you're not that
mm,
good. Um, so it's really interesting how that fits in with the whole notion of hyper conscientiousness.
mm,
Um, the extroversion, the E of ocean is something we could spend more time on. I'll just simply say that these are individuals who seek out positive reinforcement
mm,
and are very sensitive to reward cues. They're characterized by what are called immediacy cues. When they're interacting with people, they stand close for comfortable communication.
mm,
They engage in a lot of gesticulatory behavior and so on. The more introverted people stand back more. They're much more comfortable in environments that have low levels of stimulation,
mm,
and they can end up having some considerable um, periods of awkwardness in their social interactions. There's another combination of this with um, people who are agreeable, or in this case, the other end of the dimension, disagreeable, tend to be very blunt and straightforward and I have a favorite anecdote that I have of an extremely extroverted guy who was a colleague of mine. We
Hmm.
did consulting work together, and we'll call him Tom because that was his name. And we he was as different from me as two people can be. First, he's 6'5", and I have a tendency not to be. Uh, he's uh, he's a classic extrovert. I am an extreme introvert, and that may surprise people because I don't sound like an introvert, I guess. Certainly, when I'm lecturing as a professor, I don't. And we had seconded to our project a person who was as different, who basically caused major schisms in the project team. And the person who seconded him found out about this and said to Tom, "So what do you think of Michael?"
Mm.
And Tom responded in classic extrovertese. I'll tell you what he said in a moment. And then they said to me, "Brian, what do you think of Michael?" And I said, "Well, Michael," and this is classic introvert speak, we hedge things, we use
Mm.
weasel words. So I said, "Well, Michael has a tendency at times of behaving in a way that some of us might see as perhaps more assertive than is normally called for."
Mm.
And Tom just rolled his eyes. He said, "Brian, that's what I said. He's an asshole." Now, As
Yeah.
as an introvert, I might gently allude to certain asholic qualities in this man's behavior, but I'm not going to lunge for the A word. But Tom was a classic extrovert. He's a bit disagreeable as well, and I, we were very close friends. And as long as you realize that these are our natural propensities, these are our biogenic propensities,
Mm.
then you can say, "Oh, you're a funny little guy." Or there you go again. And it's instead of pointing at a person and indicting them on a charge of introversion or
Mm.
extroversion, it's a way of saying that's a really interesting kind of feature of personality you have, and I love you.
I guess it's almost like when you're giving feedback, you want to be describing a person's behavior. You want to label the behavior because the behavior is very situational. If you start talking
Yeah,
about you are this or you are that, then
yeah.
you're labeling their personality. And who are you to tell me that I am this? Yes, you can observe my behavior, and maybe I was a little overly assertive or not diplomatic enough in that case.
Mhm.
But to paint to paint everything the way that Jason is, his personality is this. I think
Yeah.
that's probably a little slippery slope. Behavior is easy because behaviors can be changed, at least from my
Mhm.
perspective.
Yeah, very much so. And this is why I think that um, when we start moving from traits to projects, if I can get into just a little bit of the science of the statistical aspect of it, that we can look at how much traits influence such things as happiness and positive emotions, negative emotions, and so on. And there's research that shows that there is a link between those, but they're mediated by the experiences you have with your personal projects. If you take
Mm.
projects out of it, then those links are going to diminish. And so the beauty of that to me is that while it is possible to change our traits, and we might talk about that perhaps, it's a lot easier to change the mediating projects which help bring about positive life outcomes. You can, if one of the reasons that extroverted people have, or let's reverse it, introverted people are less likely to make advances in domains of the social, is because they don't engage with people.
Mm.
Then instead of changing introversion as a fixed trait, you can provide strategies whereby they can learn how to introduce themselves without being embarrassed or do various things to
And this
increase
can
their
be
social.
this could be like a personal project, a very mini personal project. How
Yeah,
to, for example, speak in front of people or how to
yeah,
engage. Okay, okay.
yeah, exactly. And many personal projects are actually projects to change your personality. One of the most frequent projects is to be less shy,
Mm.
to be less introverted, or to be less anxious. And so these are each of these is a variation on the theme of one of the big fives wanting to change it. If you
Mhm.
ask people if they want to change their personalities, they most say yes. Um, and most say yes in the direction of wanting to be, let's go through the ocean, more open, more conscientious, um, more extroverted, more agreeable, and less neurotic.
Yeah,
And
that's what I was gonna say. I hope less neurotic.
yeah,
More neurotic.
that's the one reversal there,
Yeah.
right? And just a couple of words on those last two, because we haven't
Please,
talked
please.
about this explicitly. The agreeableness is it highly agreeable people are great to have in groups because they
Mm.
lubricate things. Yeah, everything, they're averse to conflict. And so if somebody's getting snarky, the highly agreeable person says, well, okay, Bud's doing his usual
Mm.
stick it to us stuff. Let's take a look at, and so they'll move it along, and people who are getting a little uncorked because of Bud are happy to have that agreeable person there. Um, on the downside of agreeableness, they can be taken advantage of. There's a certain degree of compliance
Mm.
that comes with agreeableness because they don't like to be involved in conflict situations, and that's a kind of personal downside. Um, on the highly disagreeable side, there's some really interesting evidence that they are more likely to experience health challenges, particularly relating to cardiovascular events. Um, And part of this is that a key feature of low agreeableness
Mhm.
is is hostility. And we
Mm.
know that, we used to talk about the type A personality and used to think it was this hurry sickness or somebody who was always busy, 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 busy. And that was the pathogen leading to
Mm.
cardiac problems. It's not that, it's the hostility. And it leads to a really interesting conundrum, which is if you have somebody who's very extroverted and very busy, 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 but isn't particularly hostile.
Mm.
And you're at a at a beach holiday and with your spouse, and you've been away for a couple of weeks, and your partner says, "You're going back to the room, aren't you? And check your email. I know you're going to do that. I can tell. Stay there. Don't get up. Stay where you are. You're going to relax on this. This is our bloody holiday. So
Mm.
relax." Ironically, if he's just an extrovert, he's not a type A, he has no hostility, you're likely to increase hostility,
Mm.
which is precisely the pathogen you're trying to steer him away from. So,
Mm.
again, it gets into these delightful, uh, very, very human features that make us intriguing as a species and make living with each other sometimes a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it. You know,
Mhm.
in your books, you describe as personalities are not fixed and that are not unchangeable, that they are fluid per se. I'm
Mhm.
curious more about a little more about how technology impacts this. With the rise of social media and digital communication, how do you see
Mhm.
these technologies affecting our personalities and also to your title, our well-being?
Hmm. Oh boy, that's timely, isn't it? And I wish I had a really clear answer to that. My answer
Mm.
is going to be a typical professorial, introverted, contingent, weasel word
Okay.
one, if you could forgive me at least this one.
Fire
And
away.
that is, it depends a great deal on the
Mm.
kind of medium. It depends on the personality. A couple of my students actually did theses on the impact of social network
Mm.
on well-being as mediated by personality. And the results were complex. Basically, you raise this in the context of free trade, so it's a really perceptive way of framing it, because it may be that um, when we're on social media, we can act out of character
Mm,
in ways that we were never allowed to before. You can be a blunt jerk
mm,
on social media, or you may present yourself in ways that appear to be um, those who know you as
mm,
being very unlike you. Who on earth are you pretending to be when you were on your blog? You sound like you're from the um, wrestling fraternity rather than a professor of divinity at Yale. And so I think that um, the media give us an opportunity to stretch the bounds of our presentation
mm,
of self to the world. I think the jury's out on whether it is a net good or bad. An awful lot of people decry the fact that um, that we have lost direct contact with people. And this was particularly so during COVID, so that we're
mm,
spending a lot of time away from natural interactions with other individuals. Can having 600 friends take the place of having three or four intimate friends?
mm,
Um, you know, for some extroverts, it might. For some highly agreeable, intimate, um, maybe more introverted individuals, it could never even come close
mm,
to simulating what you have when Debbie and Gary come over, and Sharon, and you
mm,
hang out on a Thursday night, and you love each other, and there's no substitute for that for some sensitive people. And so it's again that combination of medium, which we can think of as being sort of on the contextual side of things, of the big equation, and personality interacting to create
mm.
um, good outcomes or bad outcomes. So I'm sorry if that was
No, no,
too
no. It was just more of a curiosity for me because when it comes
you
to the
know,
big five, as you said, the openness, the conscientiousness, the extra being extroverted, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and how you said, sometimes you find, people on the extremes, and most of us fall somewhere in the middle of the bell curve.
yeah.
I wonder sometimes if social media, because, we can sort of hide behind a mask or a pseudonym or whatever, that sometimes the ones on the extreme ends, the social media allows them to even express themselves in even a much more destructive or volatile or hostile kind of way. And it was more of a curiosity for me how
Oh,
social
that
plays.
yeah. Yeah, in a way you've taken the opposite tack to what I took. And I think in a way yours is more plausible, that it does allow those who are at the extreme, who otherwise might feel they need to modulate their behavior,
Mm,
to just pull out the plugs and let themselves go. And the angry person who in everyday interaction is likely to curtail those extremely hostile
mm,
responses is just free to let blast. Whether that's going to redound to their well-being or
mm,
not is a really interesting question. For example, we know that people who are very low on agreeableness are happiest
mm,
when they're engaged in situations where they're having conflictful exchanges with other people.
mm,
So managers who are firing somebody who are low in agreeableness are really
mm,
happy. You're fired. Whoa,
mm,
that felt good. And there's some serious research on this, and
mm,
it seems that um, there are there are maybe it is that the media gives a much broader array of routes through which we can
mm,
be happy, including those that certainly don't lead to increases in human happiness at larger scale,
mm,
but may prove satisfying to the individuals themselves,
Mm.
who are freed, as it were, to pursue their natural biogenic um, proclivities.
Yeah, I just found it fascinating. You know,
Mm,
a strong part of your the content of your book is the adaptability of personality.
yeah.
I was wondering, listeners might be thinking, okay, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And a lot of people have the misconception that personalities are they're static, they're written in stone. But
Mm,
according to what you've written, 2 volumes, that is not the truth. So my
right.
question is, how can individuals or listeners, if they wanted to cultivate more psychological flexibility effectively, are there some sort of concrete things they can do? Is there certain focuses that they can pay attention to?
Yeah, I think that acting out of character is a key point here. And there's one aspect of it that actually resonates with one of your other interviews, that you did on restorative environments,
Mm.
which is really fascinating, and I worked with some of those researchers to look at what I call restorative niches. So let me just make the case for what I call free trait behavior and how it helps us survive, develop, but sometimes create problems for ourselves.
Could you first
I,
begin maybe by operationally defining what you mean by a free trait?
sure, yeah.
Just to begin
Uh,
with.
yeah, it deserves a simple explanation to clarify at the beginning. A free trait is when you engage in behaviors that that people in general might see as a particular trait, like extroverted,
Mhm.
when in fact your own biogenic disposition is of the opposite. You're an introvert, or you're a highly agreeable person, but for some reason, over the last 3 weeks, you've been extremely disagreeable. And
Okay.
so you're engaging in a free trait there. And my meaning that it's not yoked to your biogenic disposition. It's
You're
free
acting
to
out of character as you said earlier.
exactly. You're
Mm.
acting out of character. Exactly. And what those are two very frequently invoked examples.
Mm.
The introverted teacher who acts extrovertedly because she loves to get her class excited. The Y is Emily, who is the most the sweetest and most agreeable person you can imagine. For all of August, she's a hurricane of abuse because she's trying to get her mom
Mm.
into a care facility. She's stopped at every turn, and she's just laying into the administration.
Mhm.
She's engaged in free trade disagreeableness. Why? Because she has a core project that is to take care of my mom.
Mm.
And in the case of the teacher, she has a core project to excite my students. Um, and you can do this for a bit, and it's okay. But if you protractedly act out of character,
Mm.
um, it can take a toll on your sympathetic nervous system, and you can start to feel the physiological signs of incipient burnout and
Mm.
so on. But for example, as I've mentioned, I'm dispositionally very introverted, but just adore being a professor.
Mm.
I love my students. I put on a show for them, and it's genuine. Remember we were talking about fidelity early on?
Mhm.
It's genuine in the genic sense, in that I just adore them and I want to engage with them, but I'm not an extrovert. And so if I do that for a protracted period of time, I'm really overstimulated. And unlike an extrovert, if there's a break in the class and we come back after 10 minutes, I have to leave. And a true extrovert would stay and talk to the students. But I have to go, and I often go to the washroom and put my feet up and make sure nobody sees me so I can get a restorative
Mm.
niche where I can lower my stimulation level.
Mm.
Often a student will come in to the cubicle next door, and if anything's guaranteed to constipate an introvert for 6 months, is talking to a student
In the toilet.
in the John. But that is why we need restorative niches that actually work. And when you were talking about restorative cities, it's not just restoration in the sense of having environments that are green and close to nature, but it's also providing niches, spaces, but also um, states
Mm,
and other projects that you can engage in that are restorative for you. What restoration for me means, it gets you back for a time to your first nature, to your
mm,
biogenic state. So it allows you, if you're an overstimulated introvert, to settle down where you're in a much more um, comfortable position. And that um, I think that um, we often act out of character um, for two reasons. We do it professionally
mm,
because we have to. If you're a disagreeable, neurotic person, you're not going to do very well in a
mm,
lot of life's professional niches. You're going to change, um, and so we do it out of professionalism, but we also do it out of love.
mm,
And many people will say that they have had a long-term relationship where they're just beginning to realize, and I've had people write to me about this, that
mhm,
I've been acting out of character for 15 years because I love my partner. And she's a flaming extrovert. And
mm,
we go out and go out and go out and go out. And I'm burnt out, but
mm,
I love her dearly. But I'm feeling I need, well, what I have called a free trade agreement. Now, it's a pun on free trade agreement, but uh, it means that I will act out of character for you if you'll reciprocate and
mm,
and act out of character for me, and or if you will grant me a restorative niche. So let's take the reverse. A person who is very introverted, who has, in a sense, inhibited
mm,
um, his extroverted um, partner, after a period where they've been in for a long time, a free trade agreement will say, yes, of course, you can
mm,
go out with the girls on Friday night. I encourage you to do that. Of course, you're able to, you can do that. You're an
mm,
agentic woman. But I fully think this is a great idea
mm,
because when you come back, you will have been restored. You
mm,
need this. And that's the free trade agreement. And perhaps as difficult to negotiate as the Middle East agreements right now,
mm.
but it's something that I strongly recommend as a way of sustaining the joint projects of a marriage.
I really like that term restorative niche. I haven't come across it till obviously it's a
Mhm.
term that you've created, but I really love that because what you just characterized that relationship, my wife is quite extroverted, I'm quite introverted.
Hmm.
And so we go out to dinner, we go out with friends sometimes, and
Mhm.
I'll do that. It's a
Mhm.
how can I say this? I'm more introverted than extroverted. It depends on the situation. I don't
Yeah.
mind social events. But
Mhm.
just like you, I have to retract myself. And I think I've been with my wife since 95. We've been together forever. But I think
Yeah.
what makes, such opposite personalities work is that ability to negotiate, these complexities sometimes. Yes, we get in arguments, of course, and they'll
Yeah.
blowouts. And then sometimes everything's smooth. But I think
Mhm.
being able to have that flexibility with each other. So
Yeah.
sometimes when we are out of character, right?
Mhm.
That we move back to that restorative niche where we can recharge our batteries, we can come back to ourselves, we can find that refuge per se,
Yep.
just to kind of, I guess, recharge ourselves. That's the best term I can come up with. I
Yeah.
really like that. And I think
Yep.
three things that really came out to me, what you've been talking about. First of all, is the self-awareness, to be able to
Yes.
switch That's how we can become flexible, the adaptability, understand the ecosystem you're moving into and what traits does it require. And I
Yep.
think self-compassion, to understand that sometimes you'll mess up, but it's okay. You'll learn and adapt the next time. But I think also what you've also talked a lot about was sort of self-efficacy, the ability where I can focus my energies and what I can do in order to maybe I'm out of character for a while, but then I can find alignment in these restorative niches. Those are the kind of the three selves that I see that you've kind of, at least in my head, that you've kind of touched on that are very important.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. I love the example. Um, I think what I found over the years is just having people be aware of this issue.
Mm,
Um, it doesn't require counseling or anything like that. Just being aware that sometimes your own personality um, throws you into situations where, without you realizing it, and certainly not intending it,
mm,
your partner may be giving the illusion of comfort, but are really uncomfortable. And so, after people hear a presentation on this,
mm,
the kind that you've been curating so effectively, um, they'll often say on the drive home, "How you doing? You, you
mm,
okay? Was that a? Do you feel blitzed?" And the answer is, yeah. I need. It's not very efficacious, but I think I need a G&T. But it'd be better if I just had a little walk by
yeah,
myself. Yeah,
mm,
not even the dog. Just
mm,
let me unwind. And to realize that
mm,
the restorative niche for her may be the very opposite of a restorative niche for him.
mm,
A restorative niche for a person who has acted pseudo introverted, as so many people do in the office every day,
mm,
is to go out and get stimulated, go and talk to a bunch of people, and uh, the very opposite of what is my restorative niche or might be yours, Jason.
mm,
So I think that it again, it goes to the complexity of personality, but the utility of views that give the general advice that you need to be flexible to adapt and survive and thrive. And
mm.
I think that's the theme of both books.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's been a very stimulating conversation. I learned a lot, and
Thank you.
I've got some terms that I'm going to be adopting. I'm not saying they're my terms, but they're part. They're going to be part of my vernacular now. Restorative niches. That was my favorite.
Yeah,
Um,
it's great. Yeah,
I really appreciate your time and sharing your experience and your knowledge today.
it was a pleasure, and the questions were really stimulating. Thanks, Jason.
You're more than welcome.
Cheers.